When a story breaks in the morning, it is sometimes difficult to get a proper handle upon its significance if, like you are, like me, an absolute amateur at everything. BBC were going nuts this morning over the imminent signing or the actual signing of a mineral and profit-sharing deal between Ukraine and the United States. This is yesterday evening in Washington, D.C. It does nothing. It does none of the things that Donald Trump insisted it would do. I mean, literally none of them. But it does apparently create the possibility of a partnership, a sharing on a 50-50 basis of the so-called earth minerals that Ukraine possesses in return for continuing US contribution to Ukraine's resistance of what, for the first time, I think, Donald Trump's administration described as Russia's full-scale invasion. So he hasn't stopped the war on day one. He hasn't got the $300 billion in back payments on the US contribution to the defense of Ukraine, which he demanded, despite the fact that, in classic Trumpian fashion, the real figure wasn't even $300 billion. It was $130 billion since 2022. He hasn't done a deal with Vladimir Putin or managed to persuade Vladimir Putin to stop his hostilities. He hasn't done anything that he said he would do, but he has done something, which will no doubt evince another lap of honour. That's what I've worked out how he operates. He says he's going to give you the world. He ends up with about 1/20th of the world, and he claims that was the plan all along, and he's a genius for pulling it off. But don't take my word for it. Phillips O'Brien is the Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews, and he joins me now. Is this a champagne cork moment, do you think, Phillips, for Ukrainians or indeed the rest of us?
Trump has changed his entire worldview. He no longer likes Putin. He loves Ukraine. Everything's going to be wonderful. And the world is transformed. The hope that people put into Donald Trump is astonishing. That he just throws these occasional little tidbits and people lose their mind. This agreement has nothing concrete for Ukraine. There's no security guarantees for Ukraine. There's no permanent even pledges of aid. There's nothing to it. In fact, it's really something that talks about generating income 10 years down the road. It's probably, look, I don't know. Trump didn't tell me what he was doing. But it's probably, something that he can claim political victory to his base. We've made Ukraine pay. It doesn't cost the U.S. anything. The thing that drives me nuts, though, is it makes people have hope in Trump. And I think having hope in Trump is a really dangerous thing to have because it means you're not looking at reality.
Why then would Ukraine cooperate in this process? I think I know the answer. I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from you.
Yeah, they have nothing to lose. Yeah. I mean they maybe got $50 million of aid out of it, which $50 million, by the way, would be eaten up in a few minutes in this war. But they don't have anything to gain by angering Trump and being particularly difficult. They actually stood up to him, from what we can tell. The original versions of this deal were terrible for Ukraine, and they refused those. So they give him a political victory. They pretend like it provides some interest of the U.S. in a Ukrainian victory, which it doesn't. And they can claim it was a success too. But I think people talking about this making a major difference have simply not learned the lesson of the last few months and years.
I'm thinking of Joseph Heller, actually. I mean, we spoke yesterday on the programme about the Supreme Court ruling 9-0, demanding the return of the deported man, and Trump parading it as the opposite. I mean, publicly claiming his advisors had told him that he won 9-0. So I don't think we live in a world, Phillips, where conceivably the war continues and Trump claims that he's actually ended it.
Well, he's still never broken with Putin. That's the thing is, he keeps saying, I'm angry at Putin. In fact, one point, he pissed off at Putin.
Yes, he did use that word.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know. At least it's not the local elections.
Correct, yeah, don't go there.
But what happens is that he says these things, but he does nothing. He's not done anything tough on Putin. Putin continues. Last night, the Russians attacked Odessa. They continue these civilian attacks all the time, and Trump does nothing about them. he is not going to be anti-Russian or anti-Putin. That's not what he is. And it's one of those that the people are grasping around to try and find things that make them feel better rather than facing, I think, the truth of where we are.
Well, with that in mind, and I hope I don't grasp around on this, but it's better than the US walking away completely, which we feared a little. Is it or not?
Well, this is an interesting thing. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I don't know, James, but I don't know this because in many ways, the U.S. walking away forces Europe to act and look after itself. And I've come to the conclusion that might not be a bad thing.
Even in the short term? Even
in the short term, because the longer it's delayed, the longer it takes. And it would be much better for European states to realize this is where we are. And the U.S. is not to be relied upon, and stop trying to have all these meaningless symbolic victories with Trump and get on with the fact of Europe looking after itself. So personally, I'm not persuaded by the argument that this could be a good thing because it provides a fig leaf. In many ways, rip the fig leaf off.
Okay.
And let's look at the world as it is.
And Europe needs to get its house in order sooner rather than later, and this increases the possibility of some European leaders opting for later rather than sooner.
Absolutely. Anything that delays is bad.
What should we be looking for then in terms of detail?
The only really thing to see if there's any substance to this continued military aid to Ukraine.
Yeah.
All right. That's the test. Now, if the United States allows Ukraine and gives Ukraine more military aid, then that's a sign that the deal might have some teeth. If there's no military aid that follows up beyond the 50 million, which again is meaningless.
Yes, of course.
Then I think we can say that this was a sham.
And when would we know that? I know that's a slightly speculative
Well, we all
question.
know it if there's more military aid, but if there's no military aid...
Should we just wait to see whether or not the tap is turned back on again?
Yeah, absolutely. If there's no military aid announced in the next few weeks, then nothing's there.
And final question, Phillips, if it isn't, where does that leave Ukraine? If the tap is not turned back on, and if Europe doesn't offer up an alternative supply in the time available, where does that leave Ukraine? And indeed Putin?
If Europe does nothing, then Ukraine will be in a bad position in a few months. European states have been stepping up a little bit more. They need to step up more than they have. I mean, one thing we have seen is the Ukrainian defense has become quite successful in the last few months, and the Russians really are suffering in their attempts to go forward. So it's not like this is hopeless for Ukraine at all. But having no U.S. aid and no improved European aid is not an ideal solution.
No, clearly not. Thank you, Phillips. So, I mean, as I mentioned just before I introduced you, the scale and the tone of the coverage in some quarters this morning has been a little bit ill-advised.
It's like the St. Peter's picture. Oh, my God, Zelensky and Trump sitting in St. Peter's. They're going to love... People just get suckered in by Trump time and time again. It's actually one of the reasons for his success.
Of course it is. Thank you. Thanks to your counsel and contributions. I hope that this programme, and among others, I hope that this programme is not one of the places that keeps getting suckered in by Trump. But while he was talking, how many people were thinking about Kemi Badenoch's trade deal with Texas? A big announcement, lots of fanfare. Absolutely nothing in it.